Okay, today, I have the fan blowing right next to me here. Today, we are going to read through the Epistle of James. This is an early epistle. It was written by, we call him James. His actual name was Jacob. Exactly how we go from Jacob to James is just one of those things where translating names from one language to another just kind of changes the name over time. Originally in Hebrew it would have been Yaakov, or how you pronounce it, which would have been the same name as the patriarch Jacob from way back in Genesis. And then it got turned into a Greek version of that name, and then that Greek got turned into a Latin version, and that Latin got turned to English, and letters came and went, and somehow Jacob becomes James in English. I don't really know. Honestly, I don't. I've read about it, but the process by which words and names travel through languages and get sounds added and dropped is interesting, but it's hard for me to follow. I've read about it, but it's nitty-gritty that it's hard for me to keep track of. Anyway, we call it James. Hebrew name Jacob. This is probably, most likely, he doesn't explicitly identify himself as this, but this is most likely the James who was the half-brother of Jesus, probably Joseph and Mary's first son after Jesus, like the biological firstborn son of Joseph and Mary, most likely. He was not a believer in Jesus as the Messiah during Jesus' earthly ministry, but he did become a believer either possibly very late in Jesus' ministry or certainly right afterwards. Jesus made an appearance to him after the crucifixion and resurrection. We read about that in 1 Corinthians. He was one of those that got a special viewing of Jesus. We don't read about that account in the Gospels, but Paul mentions it in his creed in 1 Corinthians 15. So it seems as though maybe even by the time Jesus was crucified, James was already kind of leaning in that direction. At any rate, after Jesus' resurrection, he did become a believer in Jesus as the Messiah. And so did at least one of Jesus' other brothers, Jude, which we'll read a letter from that guy later on. Jesus had 4 brothers. I don't know about the other 2, but at least these 2 became followers of him as a Messiah after his resurrection. He became the leader of the Jerusalem church, the congregation of Christians meeting in Jerusalem, after Peter left. Now, we're reading this somewhat out of sequence. Okay, we haven't started Acts yet. Now, we read the epistles of John 1, John 2, John 3, right after we finished the Gospel of John, even though those are out of sequence because those were written much later in time after the Gospels took place. Those are some of the last books of the New Testament written. But they are so similar in style and theme and content to the Gospel of John that it just made sense to go right into them after finishing the Gospel of John. Here with James, chronologically, this would occur probably sometime around the year 50 or so AD. He's writing to Jewish Christians not living in Jerusalem. James stayed in Jerusalem. In fact, he died in Jerusalem. So he never left Jerusalem. He addresses the letter to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. So he's probably referring to Jewish Christians who were not living in Jerusalem. We read in Acts chapter 7 that the church got scattered after the martyrdom of Stephen, the first witness to be put to death for Christ. After that happened, the church scattered and they left the city, or some of them did at least. Some of them stayed. The apostles stayed. James stayed. But a lot of the rank and file of the church left Jerusalem after that. So James is probably writing to those people. He's not writing to any one congregation. This is probably that James. It's probably the leader of the Jerusalem church, half-brother of Jesus, writing to the Jewish Christians who left the city after, or sometime after the persecution started, or sometime during that time frame. Chronologically, this could fit in somewhere in the middle of Acts. This is probably being written before Gentiles started to take over the church in great numbers. There's really no mention of Gentiles, really. I mean, not especially in this letter. So this is probably being written before Paul really gets his ministry going as the apostle of the Gentiles. My hair is standing on end. Holy cow. This is probably being written before Paul really gets his ministry going as the apostle of the Gentiles. Oh, man. That's, I have to do something about that. I look kind of crazy. So probably pretty early. In fact, a lot of people would say this is likely the earliest book of the New Testament that was written. His style, his content is very Jewish in nature. He is speaking to a Jewish audience. He was actually respected by the Jews in Jerusalem, which is one of the reasons why he was able to maintain his position. He did eventually get put to death, but even that was an unpopular decision by the authorities. The people in Jerusalem weren't liked James, even though he was a Christ follower. Okay, I got it. I just look too goofy with my hair standing up like that. Even though he was a Christ follower, he was respected by the Jerusalem community, even those who were not Christ followers. So his death was not received favorably by the people at the time. But he was able to stay in Jerusalem up until the very end. This is probably being written several years before that. He was put to death, as far as I think we've identified his death year as 62 AD. This is probably being written about 10 or so years before that. His message overall, he seems to. Okay, so the letter is addressed to the Jewish Christians living outside Jerusalem. So that's his audience. He's not writing to any particular church, and it seems to be a fairly general letter that isn't giving advice for any specific set of circumstances, but kind of a broader, a more general, life guide, so to speak, guide to life, without getting into the details of any particular church. But he does seem to be writing about Jewish Christians who are living in very poor conditions outside the city of Jerusalem, which again fits a 50s or so AD context when there was a famine going on. Paul, when we get to the Epistles of Paul in the book of Acts, will want to be going back to Jerusalem with a donation gathered from the Grecian churches. He wants to go back and bring this collection of money to Jerusalem to offer it there to the churches. Because there was some kind of a famine going on that put a lot of people in poverty. It seems as though, according to the context of James, that a lot of the elites, a lot of the Jewish elites that were living in the land at the time still, had squeezed a lot of these Jewish Christians out of their land or money. It was just possibly part of the threat to remove them from the synagogue. We read about that when we read through the Gospels, that one of the threats that the ruling establishment used to keep people in line, not just Christians, but Jewish Christians, but just in general, was the threat of removing your place from the synagogue, which would have left you in perilous situations because you wouldn't have had the resources, access to the resources of the synagogue. And the synagogue also was a legalized form of worship in the Roman Empire. And if you weren't a member of the synagogue, you didn't have a legal excuse then not to be participating in the Roman worship system. This would have been a problem for Jewish Christians in particular, or Jews in general. So it seems as though this is being written in a context in which these wealthy, landowning Jewish elites were squeezing poor Jews and Jewish Christians being among them out of their land and money, which has been going on for years. I mean, the prophets talked about that in the Old Testament too, and that's of course how life always is. The rich always find ways to squeeze out the poor. It's going on to this day as well. So that seems to be what's happening, and so somewhere probably in the early 50s AD. And the book itself is basically, the content of the book is basically a combination of Jesus' teachings particularly the Sermon on the Mount and the book of Proverbs. He's basically writing a version of wisdom literature. This is the New Testament wisdom book. When we read the Old Testament, we read through Psalms and Proverbs and Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes and Job. Those are the wisdom books of the Old Testament. And James is the wisdom book of the New Testament. He's basically writing like an updated version of Proverbs. He is essentially combining the life lessons of Proverbs with the teachings of Jesus, especially as contained in the Sermon on the Mount. So as we read through the letter of James, we're going to be making a lot of references to the teachings of Jesus. There's also a good amount of overlap between what James says and what John said in the epistles of John that we already read. So we're going to be he's going to explain some things, for example, about sin and the nature of being drawn away into sin, which John also talks about in terms of being honest about your sin, not saying that you don't sin, confessing your sin, being turned away back from your sin to Jesus again, or the sin that leads to death, which is a sin that you don't want to turn away from. James has a version of those kinds of things in his letter too. James, of course, is very action-oriented, very, practice-oriented, practical, and less theological, less doctrinal. It's different from Paul, because Paul has a lot of emphasis on doctrine in a lot of his books, his letters. And he also talks about works in a way that seems to go against what Paul says in some of his letters, especially Romans and Galatians. Now, being a lifelong Lutheran, having grown up in the Lutheran Church, James, therefore, is a problem. It was a problem for Martin Luther, and it's been kind of an issue for the Lutheran denomination in the 500 years since Martin Luther, so we'll talk about that too. I think that's enough for the intro to James, I believe.